his 11 honors, and we're finishing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That night I had come to the fatal crossroads. Had I approached my discovery in a more noble spirit, had I risked the experiment while under the empire of generous or pious aspirations, all must have been otherwise. And from these agonies of death and birth, I had come forth an angel instead of a fiend. The drug had no discriminating action. It was neither diabolical or divine. I'll have to think about that. I don't understand. The drug is neutral. It doesn't turn him into evil. So I guess it just enhances what's already there. I'm not sure exactly what he means by that, but anyway. It but shook the doors of the prison house of my disposition, and like the captives of Philippi, that which stood within ran forth. At that time, my virtue slumbered, my evil kept awake by ambition, was alert and swift to seize the occasion. The thing that was projected was Mr. Hyde. Hence, although I had now two characters as well as two appearances, one was wholly evil and the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, that incongruous compound of whose reformation and improvement I had already learned to despair. The movement was thus wholly toward the worse. Maybe I'm missing something, if anybody can explain that to me. The question is, why did the evil, Mr. Hyde, why did the evil come separate from Jekyll? Why was that what became separate? In other words, why couldn't he have created a really good person? And we already know that's not possible, but neither is this. So I'm not sure I understand that completely. Even at the time, I had not conquered my aversion to the dryness of life and study. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and my pleasures were, to say the least, undignified. And I was not only well known and highly considered, but growing towards the elderly man. This incoherency of my life was daily growing more unwelcome. It was on this side that my new power tempered me until I fell in slavery. So I guess he indulged the evil in him. That's why, Paul again is trying to avoid the evil and the sin, but he indulged it. And so he has nobody to blame but himself. I fell into slavery. We talked about addiction. That's what he means. I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of the noted professor, and to assume like a thick cloak that of Mr. Hyde, of Edward Hyde. I smiled at the notion. It seemed to me at the time to be humorous, and I made my preparation with the most studious care. I took and furnished that house in Soho, to which Hyde was tracked by the police, and engaged as a housekeeper a creature whom I well know to be silent and unscrupulous. On the other side, I announced to my servants that a Mr. Hyde, whom I described, was to have full liberty and power about my house in the square. And to parry mishaps, I even called and made myself a familiar object in my second character. I next drew up that will to which you so much objected, so that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll, I could enter own of that Mr. Hyde without pecuniary loss. And thus, fortified, I suppose, on every side, I began to profit by the strange immunities of my position. Men have before fired salvos to transact, bravos. They didn't fire salvos, they hired bravos. Bravo, by the way, is a substitute. To transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under shelter. I was the first that ever did so for his pleasure. I was the first that could plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spring headlong into the sea of liberty. But for me, in my impenetrable mantle, the safety was complete. Think of it, I did not even exist. Let me but escape into my laboratory door, Give me but a second or two to mix this and swallow the drought that I had always standing ready. And whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would pass away like the stain of breath upon a mirror. And there in the steady, quietly at home, in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at suspicion would be Henry Jekyll. So you see, it's all about hiding the bad so nobody could see it, so he couldn't get in trouble, so he could get away with it. It's an answer to Paul's problem about he's good and bad, have inclinations toward both. Except the difference, again, Paul really doesn't want to do bad. He just can't stop it. Jekyll is making being bad his habit. He's making things work out so that he can be bad. And he's already sees he's enslaved to it. I'll read one more. The pleasures which I made haste to seek in my disguise were, as I've said, undignified. You know, he never identifies his sins. He never tells us what he does. You use your imagination. I think that's what he intended for us to do. But we don't know what it is. What did he? And we know he killed a man, but other than that, what did he actually do? I would scarce use a harder term. But in the hands of Edward Hyde, they soon began to turn toward the monstrous. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged to a kind of wonder at my vicarious depravity. This familiar that I called out of my own soul and sent forth alone to do his good pleasure was a being inherently malign and villainous. His every act and thought centered on self. Drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another, relentless like a man of stone. Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde, but the situation was apart from ordinary laws and insidiously relaxed the grasp of conscience. It was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone, that was guilty. Jekyll was no worse. He woke again to his good qualities, seemingly unimpaired. He would even make haste, where it were possible, to undo the evil done by Hyde, and thus his conscience slumbered. Aurora.
Into the details of the infamy at which I thus
Connived.
for even now I had scarce grant that I committed it. I have no design of entering. I mean but to point out the warnings and the successive steps with which my chastisement approached. I met with one accident which, as it brought on no consequence, I shall no more that mention. An act of cruelty to a child aroused against me the anger of a passer-by, whom I recognized the other day in the person of your kinsman. The doctor and the child's family joined him. There were moments when I feared for my life, and at last, in order to pacify thereto just resentment, Edward Hyde had to bring them to the door and pay them in a check drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll. But this danger was easily eliminated from the future by opening an account at another bank in the name of Edward Hyde himself, and then by sloping my own hand backward. I had supplied my double with a signature. I thought I sat beyond the reach of fate. Some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, I had been out for one of my adventures, had returned at a late hour, and woke the next day in bed with somewhat odd sensations. It was in vain I looked about me, in vain I saw the decent furniture and tall proportions of my room in the square, in vain that I recognized the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame. Something still kept insisting that I was not where I was, that I had not wakened where I seemed to be, but in the little room in the Soho where I was accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde. I smiled to myself in my physiological way, began lazily to inquire into the elements of this illusion, occasionally, even as I did so, dropping back into a comfortable morning doze. I was still so engaged when, in one of my more wakeful moments, my eyes fell upon my hand. Now the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you often remarked, was professional in shape and size. thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. I must have stared upon it for near half a minute, sunk as I was in mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast, as sudden and startling as a crash of cymbals, and pounded from my bed, I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changing into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed, Henry Jekyll. I had awakened Edward Hyde.
So, we talked about that yesterday. That's the problem now. Without taking anything, he's automatically, something is causing him to turn into Hyde without taking the potion.
How was this to be explained? I asked myself, and then, with another bound of terror, how was it to be
Remedied.
It was well on in the morning. The servants were up, all my drugs were in the cabinet. A long journey, down 2 paths of stairs, through the back passage, across the open court, and through the Atomical Theater, from where I was then standing horror-struck. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but of what use was that, when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature? And then with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the coming and going of my second self. I had soon dressed as well as I was able, in clothes of my own size, had soon passed through the house, where Bradshaw stared and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour in a strange array, and 10 minutes later, Dr. Jekyll had returned to his own shape and was sitting down, with a darkened brow, to make a feint of great fasting.
Thanks, Isabella.
All I needed was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, this reversal of my previous experience, seemed like following me from around the world to be spelling out the letters in my judgment, and I began to reflect more seriously than ever before on the issues and possibilities of my double existence. That part of me which I had the power of projecting had lately been much exercising courage. It had seemed to me of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though when I wore that form I were conscious of a more generous kind of life, and I began to spy danger that if this were much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown. The power of voluntary change reflected in the character of Edward Hyde become irrevocably mine. The power of the drug had not been always equally displayed. Once very early in my career it had totally failed me. Since then I had been obliged on more than one occasion to double, and once with infinite risk of death, to treble the amount, and these rare uncertainties have cast hitherto the sole shadow on my content. Now, however, in the light of that morning's accident, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Jekyll, it had of late gradually but decidedly transferred itself to the other side. All things therefore seemed to point to this. I was slowly losing hold of my original inner self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my skin and nerves.
Somebody said it yesterday. He was now becoming Hyde, and the problem would be to become Jekyll. It used to be the other way around. So again, think of the implications of that. You will become what you do. You will become what you think about. You will become what you want. You will become what you love. And as long as we can control that, that's great. But then this book tells us what we know about these kinds of things is we eventually can't control it. So we actually become that person. And that's what's happened to him. He's now become Hyde, and he's having to get back to Jekyll. You want to keep reading or pass it? All right, thanks.
Between these two, I now felt I had conflict. My two natures had memory in common, but all other faculties were most unequally paired between them. Jekyll, who is composite, now with most sensitive apprehensions, now with the greedy gusto projected and shared in the pleasures and adventures of Hyde. But Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than the body's interest. Hyde had more than the soul's indifference. To cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die to those appetites which I had long secretly indulged, and had of late begun to
sounds exactly what Paul says, doesn't it? He says he eventually decided he wanted it to be Jekyll. He says, as it falls with so vast a majority of my fellows, I chose the better part, Jekyll. I wanted to be Jekyll, and was found wanting in the strength to do it. So now he's exactly where Paul is. He wants to be good. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. So he's actually echoing the very words of Paul, because he can't seem to now have the strength to do it. And of course, Paul's answer, we talked about, what a wretched man I am. That's confession. Who can rescue me from this body that is subject to death? And he gives credit to God. And we addressed that. You want to keep reading? Thanks.
Yes, I prefer the elderly and discontented doctor, surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hopes, and bade a resolute farewell to humility. The comparative youthful light step, leaping impulses and secret pleasures that I had enjoyed in the disguise of piety. I made this choice perhaps with some unconscious reservation, for I neither gave up the house in Soho, nor destroyed the clothes of Abinadi, which still lay ready in my cabinet. For 2 months, however, I was true to my determination. For 2 months I led a life of such severity as I had never before attained to, and enjoyed the compensations of an improving conscience. But time began at last to obliterate the freshness of my mind. Praises of conscience began to grow into a thing worse. I began to be tortured with the throes and longings, as of high struggling after freedom, and at last in an hour of moral weakness, I once again compounded and swallowed the transforming draught.
So remember, for 2 months he was always Jekyll. He finally capitulated to Hyde and took the draft. How about it, Sierra?
I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through his pursuit. Physical insensibility, neither had I, as long as I had considered my position, made enough allowance for the complete moral insensibility and readiness to evil, which were the leading characters of Edward Hyde. Yet it was by these that I was punished. My devil had been long caged, he came out roaring. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, of a more unbridled, a more furious propensity to ill. And it must have been this, I suppose, that stirred in my soul the tempest of impatience with which I listened to the civilities of, is that right?
Civilities.
Civilities of my unhappy victim. I declare at least before God, no more morally sane could have been guilty of that crime upon so pitiful a provocation, and that I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child may break a plaything. But I had voluntarily stripped myself of all those balancing instincts by which even the worst of us continues to walk, with some degree of steadiness among temptations, and in my case, to be tempted, however slightly, was to fall. Instantly the spirit of hell awoke in me enraged. With a transport of glee, I mauled the unresisting body, tasting delight from every blow. And it was not till weariness had begun to succeed that I was suddenly in the top pit of my delirium, struck through the heart by a cold thrill of terror. A mist dispersed, I saw my life to be forfeit, and fled from the scene of these excesses. At once glorying and trembling, my lust of evil gratified and stimulated. My love of life screwed to the topmost pitch. I ran to the house in Soho, and, to make assurance doubly sure, destroyed my papers. Thence I set out through the lamplight streets in the same divided ecstasy of mind, gloating on my crime, lightheadedly devising others in the future, and yet still hastening and still hearkening in my wait for the steps of the avenger. Hyde had a song upon his lips as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it, pledged the dead man. The pangs of transformation had not done tearing him before Henry Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fallen upon his knees through the self-denying toils of my professional life, to arrive again and again with the same sense of unreality at the damned horrors of the evening. I could have screamed aloud. I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memories swarmed against me. And still, between the petitions, the ugly face of my iniquity stared into my soul. As the acuteness of this remorse began to die away, it was succeeded by a sense of joy. The problem of my conduct was solved. Hide was thenceforth impossible, whether I would or not. I was now confined to the better part of my existence, and oh, how I rejoiced to think it. With what willing humility I embraced anew the restrictions of natural life. With that sincere
Renunciation.
I locked the door by which I had so often gone and come, and ground the key under my heel. The next
Okay,
day,
before you go on, he tries to make efforts to repent, so to speak. He locks the door, says he's not going to go in that room anymore where the drugs are. Sounds like what he just did earlier, except he didn't make any provisions to get rid of anything. Earlier he said, I want to be Jekyll, but he kept all the opportunities. Now he's saying, no, I'm going to get rid of all those temptations and see how things go. Thank you. Keep reading.
the next day came the news that the murder had been overlooked. The guilt of Hyde was patent to the world, and that the victim was a man of high and public estimation. It was not only a crime, it had been a tragic folly. I think I was glad to know it. I think I was glad to have my better impulses thus buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now my city of refuge. But Hyde to peep out in an instant, and the hands of all men would raise to take its place. I resolved in my future conduct to redeem the past, and I can say with honesty that my resolve was fruitful of some good. You know yourself how earnestly in the last months of the last year I labored to relieve suffering. You know that much was done for others, and that the days passed quietly, almost happily for myself. Nor can I truly say that I wearied of this beneficial and innocent life. I think instead that I daily enjoyed it and more completely. But I was still cursed with my duality of purpose, and as the first edge of my penitence wore off, the lower side of me, so long indulged, so recently chained down, began to growl for license. Now that I dreamed of resuscitating, Hyde, the bare idea of that would startle me to frenzy. No, it was not in my own person that I once was more tempted to trifle with my conscience, and it was an ordinary secret sinner that I at last fell before the assault of temptation.
Thanks.
There comes an end to all things. The most
Capacious.
capacious measure is filled at last, and this brief
Condescension.
condescension to my evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul. And yet I was not alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days before I made my discovery. It was a fine, clear January day, wet underfoot where the frost had melted, but cloudless overhead, and the Regent parks were full of winter chirpings and sweet whispering hope. I sat in the sun on a bench.
Okay, would you underline that? Because I'm going to ask you to remember this event right here. There are a lot of these little details you won't need to know, but this is significant. He's made the decision to be Jekyll. He's kind of closed the door literally to his laboratory. Now he's happens to be one afternoon, a sunny day, just sitting on a bench. Let's see what happened.
The animal within me licking the chops of memory, and the spiritual side a little drunk, promising subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin. After all, I reflected, I was like my neighbors, and then I smiled, comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at the very moment of that began to be aware of a change in the temper of my thoughts, a great boldness, and a content of danger, a solution of the bond's obligation. I took down my clothes, hung formlessly on my shrunken limbs. The hand that I lay on my knee was corded and hairy. I was once more Edward Hyde. For a moment before I had been safe of all men's respect, wealthy, beloved, the clock lying before me in the dining room at home. And now I was in a common quarry of mankind, hunted, houseless, and no murderer enthralled to the world.
Okay, so what happens to him? He's sitting on a bench in the sun, lovely day. He's just sitting there as Dr. Jekyll. What happens to him?
He turns into Hyde.
Just spontaneously, he turns into Hyde. What's his problem? He's now completely in public. He's a wanted man, so he's scared of the police, scared somebody will see him. So this is where Dr. What was his name? The Dr. Lanyon, thank you. Dr. Lanyon comes in. He has to change over to Hyde, to Jekyll, but he doesn't have the stuff. So he goes to Lanyon and where he sends Lanyon a note and so forth. So you want to keep reading? You want me to? All right. Oh, well, can I ask you one more thing? What was his state of mind at that point? He's sitting on the bench. What's his state of mind? Well, first of all, he smiles. He says, comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with their lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at that very moment of that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me. So he was proud of himself. It was pride. It was a moment, I'm better than other people. Look at me. I'm sitting here. I'm not as bad as some of these people, and I took care of it. And at that moment, he changes. Remember that. All right. And you can.
My reason wavered, but it did not fail me out. I have more than once observed that in the second character, my faculties seemed sharpened to a point, and my spirits more tensely elastic. Thus it came about that, where Jekyll perhaps might have
Succumbed.
Hyde rose to importance in the moment. My drugs were in one of the presses of the cabinet. How was I to reach them? That was a problem that, crushing my templates in my hands, I set myself to solve. The laboratory door I had closed. If I sought to enter by the house, my own servants who consigned me to the gallows, I saw I must employ another hand and thought of Lincoln. How was he to be reached? How persuaded, supposing that I escaped a capture in the streets, how was I to make my way into the presence? And how should I, an unknown and dispelling visitor, prevail on the famous physician to rifle the study of his
Colleague.
Dr. Jekyll? Then I remembered that of my original character, one part remained to me. I could write my own hand, and once I had conceived the kindling spark, the way that I must follow became lightened up from the engine.
All right, so he's trapped in public as Mr. Hyde. If he's caught, he's a murderer. They'll put him in jail. So he has to figure out how to turn into Jekyll. So he's going to enlist the aid of Lanyon. Thereupon I arranged my clothes as best I could and summoned a passing hansom, drove to a hotel in Portland Street, the name which I chanced to remember. At my appearance, which was indeed comical enough, however, tragic of fate these garments covered, the driver could not conceal his mirth. I gnashed my teeth upon him with a gust of devilish fury, and the smile withered from his face, happily for him, yet more happily for myself, for in another instant I had certainly dragged him from his perch. At the end, as I entered, I looked about me with so black a countenance as made the attendants tremble. Not a look did they exchange in my presence, but obsequiously took my orders, led me to a private room, and brought me wherewithal to write. Hyde, in danger of his life, was a creature new to me, shaken with inordinate anger, strung to the pitch of murder, lusting to inflict pain. Yet the creature was astute, mastered his fury with great effort of the will, composed his 2 important letters, one to Lanyon and one to Poole, that he might receive actual evidence of their being posted, sent them out with directions that they should be registered. Thenceforward he sat all day over the fire in the private room, gnawing his nails. There he dined, sitting alone with his fears, the waiter visibly quailing before his eyes. And thence, when the night was fully come, he set forth in the corner of a closed cab and was driven to and fro about the streets of the city. He, I say, I cannot say, I, the child of hell, had nothing human, nothing lived in him but fear and hatred. And when at last, thinking the driver had begun to grow suspicious, he discharged the cab and ventured on foot, attired in his misfitting clothes, an object marked out for observation, into the midst of the nocturnal passengers. These 2 based passion raged within him like a tempest. He walked fast, hunted by his fears, chattering to himself, skulking through the less frequented thoroughfares, counting the minutes that still divided him from midnight. And once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights. He smote her in the face, and she fled. So he's waiting for midnight, because that's when he told Lanyon he would show up. When I came to myself at Lanyon's, the horror of my old friend perhaps affected me somewhat. I do not know. It was at least but a drop in the sea to the abhorrence with which I looked back upon these hours. A change had come over me. It was no longer the fear of the gallows, it was the horror of being Hyde that racked me. You ever not done something because you're afraid to get caught, but if you knew you weren't going to get caught, you'd done it? Have you ever, do you know where I'm coming from here? You ever thought of that? Have you ever not done something? The only reason you didn't do it is you didn't want to be caught. You really wanted to do it. It's not good, but you didn't do it because you didn't want to get caught. If you didn't get caught, you did. That's Hyde. That's what Hyde does. He knows he can't get caught up to this point, so that's why he does it. But now, what does he feel? He's not afraid. He's not afraid just of being caught. He doesn't like the person that he is. And I think that's true repentance. That's before God, if you truly don't like the person you are, like the thing you do, that's repentance. If it's just, I don't want to get caught doing this, that's not true repentance. God expects us to not like, it doesn't expect us, that's what's going to happen. When you're truly repentant, like Paul, you're going to not like the person that you are. You don't like the thing, you got away with it, but you hated yourself for doing it. You don't want to be that person. That's where Jekyll is right now. He doesn't want to be Hyde. It's not just he doesn't want to get caught, he doesn't like Hyde. I received Lanyon's condemnation partly in a dream. It was partly in a dream. I came back to my own house and got into bed. I slept after the prostration of the day with a stringent and profound slumber which not even the nightmares had wrung me could avail to break. I woke in the morning shaken, weakened, but refreshed. I still hated and feared the thought of the brute that slept within me. I had not, of course, forgotten the appalling dangers of the day before, but I was once more at home, in my own house, close to my drugs, and gratitude for my escape shone so strong in my soul that it almost rivaled the brightness of hope. Aurora, do you mind? We just have a few minutes. We just have 3 pages. So.
I was stepping leisurely across the court after breakfast, drinking the chill of the air with pleasure, when I was seized again with those indescribable sensations that herald the change. And I had put the time to gain the shelter of my cabinet. Before, I was once again riding and freezing with the passions of Hyde. It took on this occasion a double dose to recall me to myself. And alas, 6 hours after, as I sat looking sadly in the fire, the pangs returned, and the drug had to be re-administered. In short, from that day forth, it seemed only by a great effort of gymnastics, and only under the immediate stimulation of the drug, that I was able to wear the countenance of Jekyll. At all hours of the day and night, I would be taken with the premonitory shudder. Above all, if I slept or even dozed by a moment in my chair, it was always as Hyde that I awakened. Under the which I now condemned myself, I even beyond what I had thought possible to me. I became in my own person a creature eaten up and emptied by fever, languidly weak, both in body and mind, and solely accompanied by one thought, poor of my other self. But when I slept, or when the virtue of the medicine wore off, I would leap against almost without transition, for the pangs of transformation grew daily less marked, into the possession of a fancy brimming with images of terror, the soul boiling with causeless outrage, and a body that seemed not strong enough to contain the raging energies of life. The powers of Hyde seemed to have grown with the sickness of Jekyll.
Now, can you mark that point, because we're running out of time. You have a page and a half. I want you to read it. Don't you think it's interesting? He's like most addicts. They need more of the same thing just to return to normal. So you're constantly, as I've heard, you're constantly drinking or using drugs in order to get you back where you, just to feel normal. Not to feel high, but to feel normal. I think this is a book made for our time. It describes that so well. Unfortunately, it doesn't give the answer, but we know the answer. So good job. Come, we'll see you tomorrow. We'll wrap this up. We have a test on Tuesday, and we'll start Heart of Darkness.